Some places fell apart over time. Others were abandoned for reasons nobody wants to talk about, like a UK church linked to a fake preacher and a child trafficking ring, or a fort in France where 800 soldiers were trapped and left to die. Today's list includes torture prisons, cursed theme parks, and buildings with so much bad energy, they're better left to rot. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 abandoned places with shocking histories. But before we begin, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, hitting that notification bell. It truly helps out the channel. Okay, on with the list. 25. Fort Douaumont. The French built Fort Douaumont to defend the region after the Franco-Prussian War, but by World War I they'd mostly written off fixed fortifications. So when the Germans launched a surprise attack in 1916, the skeleton crew left inside was quickly overrun. The French public demanded it be taken back, and the military threw everything at it. Explosives, artillery, flamethrowers, you name it. But during the confusion, something went wrong. A fire broke out inside the fort, igniting the grenades and munitions stored below. The thick smoke had nowhere to go, and about 800 German soldiers died choking on it. Since it was too dangerous to bury the bodies outside, they were sealed into one of the galleries. Some were eventually moved to a cemetery nearby, but most of the bodies are still entombed in the fort itself. 24. Hulme Hippodrome. The crumbling theatre in Manchester opened in 1901 and spent decades putting on music hall shows before switching gears in the 40s as the second Manchester Repertory Theatre. By the 70s, it was running bingo nights. Then it shut down. For years, it was just another forgotten building, until Gilbert Dea showed up. Dea, a self-proclaimed preacher, turned the theatre into a church for his group, Gilbert Dea Ministries. And that's where things got disturbing. He told infertile couples he could give them miracle babies, claiming they'd conceive through prayer. But when the BBC started digging, they discovered that none of the babies had matching DNA with their supposed parents. As it turned out, a lot of the infants had been abducted or fraudulently taken from their families in Nairobi. Dea was extradited in 2017 and charged with child trafficking. The theater's been empty ever since. 23. Hirta. Hirta sits on the edge of nowhere. It's part of the St. Kilda archipelago, one of the most isolated places in the UK, and nobody's lived there since 1930. For centuries, islanders survived off seabirds, fish, and a handful of crops they could grow in the wind-pounded soil. They built stone homes, raised families, and held on through smallpox outbreaks and brutal storms. But the winter of 1929 broke them. The cold was severe. People died, supplies ran low, and by spring, only 36 residents were left. Grieving and exhausted, they sent a formal request to the government. Help us leave. They were evacuated the following year. Their homes, school hall, and storage huts are all that remain on the cliffside that once overlooked a living village. 22. La Posada del Sol Hotel. It was supposed to be a palace for artists and intellectuals, with over 600 rooms, murals, gardens, a chapel, theaters, and intricate tile work. But by 1945, construction had stalled under piles of debt and missing permits. The owner, Fernando Saldaña Galvan, later died near a statue of St. Francis, and according to local legends, he left a curse behind. But the ghost stories didn't stop there. A missing girl from the 60s was reportedly found dead in the basement, and there's still an altar in room 103 with candy and offerings left for her. People say the site has seen strange rituals, has hidden execution chambers, and there's even the odd strung-up mannequin. Whatever we believe, the building leans into nightmare territory. It's a monument to ambition gone wrong, and quite possibly, also something darker. 21. Willowbrook State School. Willowbrook opened in 1947 on Staten Island as a state-run institution for children with developmental disabilities. It was built for 4,000 people, but by the mid-60s, housed nearly 6,000. Conditions were so horrific that Senator Robert Kennedy famously called it a snake pit after a 1965 visit. The real turning point, however, came in 1972 when Geraldo Rivera smuggled a camera into the school and aired footage of residents confined to steel cribs with no one available to help. The national backlash triggered a lawsuit, and eventually a landmark settlement. Willowbrook officially closed in 1987, but that's not the end of the story. A creepy urban legend about a boogeyman by the name of Cropsey started floating around Staten Island in the 70s. Then, Andre Rand, a former custodian, was arrested and convicted of kidnapping 2 children linked to the Willowbrook grounds. One missing girl was actually found buried behind the campus. It stopped being folklore the minute they found a body. 20. The Roseangle Murder House. In May 1980, 78-year-old Dr. Alexander Wood and his wife Dorothy were beaten to death in their Roseangle home. The weapon was a hammer. The killer didn't stop until the place looked, in the words of investigators, like an abattoir. Even the lead detective said the level of violence was not normal. Their killer was Henry John Gallagher, a local man who'd went on to murder 2 more people in Kent before he was finally caught. He was declared insane and sent to Broadmoor instead of prison. The house itself sat empty for years, even though it was in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. Locals called it the Murder House, and it eventually got folded into Dundee's official Dark History tour. 19. Old Changi Hospital. Old Changi started as military barracks in the 30s, then became a Royal Air Force hospital under British control. But during Japan's occupation of Singapore in the 40s, the site was taken over by the Kempeitai, Japan's military police. From 1942 to 1945, the complex was used to hold prisoners and interrogate civilians and Allied personnel. Accounts from that time describe harsh treatment and extreme conditions. Local stories say that even priests and nurses may have lost their lives there. After the war, the buildings were turned into a public hospital, which stayed in use until 1997. Since closing, it's become known more for the stories than the structure. People report seeing ghostly nurses who disappear without warning, shadowy figures in old uniforms, and hear strange voices that seem to come from nowhere. 18. Château Miranda. Château Miranda, also called Château de Noisy, was built in the late 1800s for the wealthy Liedekerke de Beaufort family. It looked like something you'd find in a Gothic fairy tale, with spires, arches, and way too many windows. But the fairy tale ended when the Nazis moved in and used it as their base during World War II. Parts of the Battle of the Bulge played out on the property, and soldiers died on site. After the war, the building took a strange turn. It became a so-called holiday camp for sick children. They were sent there to rest, but not all of them made it back. For decades, the place was only associated with war and illness. Eventually, it was left to fall apart, with fires, vandalism, and structural collapse taking their toll. 17. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park. The rusting carnival in the woods has a blood-soaked backstory. In the 50s, it was the site of 2 grisly child deaths. A little girl on the swing ride was killed when a delivery truck backed into her path, and a boy drowned in the pond. The park closed after the tragedies, but the ground beneath the rides carries an older, more disturbing history. In 1783, a Shawnee attack on the Clay family farm killed 2 children and saw another captured and reportedly burned at the stake. The Clay family later retaliated. Archaeologists eventually uncovered 13 Native American skeletons, many of them children, beneath the park grounds. Today, the skeletal Ferris wheel and vine-covered rides are left to decay, and locals claim the ghosts of the children still roam the park. Lake Shawnee is known as a cursed, haunted place. 16. Red Dress Manor. Its real name is Calcott Hall, but most people know it as Red Dress Manor. It's an 18th century farmhouse in Powys, Wales, and it's been sitting untouched since the early 70s when the last resident, Ellen Jones, passed away. What made the place creepy isn't just how old it is, it's how little has changed since then. Her clothes are still there. Her personal letters, dishes, cleaning supplies, and even food left behind in the fridge haven't been moved. There's a framed photo of Ellen wearing a red dress, and that same dress hung on the door for years, which is how the house got its name. Nobody seems to know much about her life or how she died, but the interior looks like she just stepped out and never came back. 15. Poveglia Island. Nicknamed the Island of Ghosts, Poveglia might be the most haunted place in Italy. During the medieval plagues, Venetians dumped tens of thousands of victims on the island, burning many in mass pits. Some sources estimate over 100,000 people died there, and the soil itself is said to be mixed with human ash. Centuries later, in the 20s, a mental hospital opened on the island. According to legend, a mad doctor performed crude lobotomies on patients and eventually threw himself from the bell tower, claiming he was tormented by ghosts. The hospital shut down in 1968. Since then, fishermen avoid the island, and tourists aren't allowed to visit. Most locals still consider it cursed. 14. St. Gerard's Hospital. Abandoned hospitals are often creepier than asylums. In the late 1800s, the Father Hudson Society built a children's hospital in Birmingham to care for kids hit hardest by poverty-related diseases like tuberculosis. It ran for nearly 100 years before shutting down in 1988, and when it did, everything was left exactly where it was. Beds were still lined up in the wards. Wheelchairs stood gathering dust. Medical tools, patient charts, and x-rays from the kids who stayed there were never removed. Even syringes, some still marked by dry blood, were found scattered around. Amid the wreckage were small reminders of the children themselves, coloring books, toys, personal belongings that somehow survived years of exposure to the elements. The weather had wrecked most of it, but enough has remained to leave an impression. 13. Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Built in 1899, the lighthouse replaced the isolated keeper's posts and began shining its light on December 15, 1900. The same day, its 3 keepers disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until December 26th that the relief crew from the supply ship Hesperus landed and found everything as if time had stopped. The front door was locked. The beds were unmade. A half-eaten meal sat at the table. Lamps had been cleaned and refilled, but the men, James Ducant, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were gone. Odd details piled up. 2 sets of oilskins were missing, but one was still hanging. Storm damage near the west landing suggested the tower might have been hit by rough seas. An official investigation later concluded the men were likely swept off the cliffs during a storm while securing equipment. Still, the men were never found, and the stories never stopped raising questions. 12. Oradour-sur-Glane. The ruins of this village are a horrific World War II crime scene. On June 10, 1944, Nazi SS troops killed 642 people in Oradour-sur-Glane as retaliation for resistance activity. Men were rounded up and shot in the legs before being burned alive inside barns. Women and children were locked in the village church, which was then set on fire. The whole village was destroyed in just a few hours. Very few made it out alive. After the war, General de Gaulle declared the site would remain untouched. Everything, from the burned-out cars, scorched sewing machines, to the crumpled bicycles, are still lying exactly where they fell. 11. The Church of the Nine Ghosts. I know the tone in today's list keeps jumping between eerie and full-blown nightmare, but I've got to look out for everyone watching, and not every entry can be absolute horror. The real name of this church is St. George's, and it's been sitting in the Czech village of Lukova since the 1300s. It had problems from the very beginning. Fires kept breaking out for no reason, and although the place was rebuilt more than once, the roof finally gave out in 1968, right in the middle of a funeral. That was it for the locals. They walked away and never came back. The building started to fall apart until a local artist named Jakub Hadrava stepped in and tried something different. He filled the pews with 9 hooded plaster figures to keep the place from being torn down. Since then, more have been added, but the name stuck. The place is technically art now, but it doesn't feel like anyone in those pews is just there to be looked at. 10. Diplomat Hotel. The former Dominican retreat house looks like a crumbling hotel today, but back in 1913, it was built as a Dominican friary. Sadly, during World War II, Japanese troops occupied the site, and according to local legends, it basically turned into a slaughterhouse. Refugees were dragged inside, and nuns and priests who offered shelter were reportedly executed. In the 70s, a faith healer named Tony Agpawa turned it into the Diplomat Hotel. He ran it until his death in 1987, and not long after, the doors were shut for good. Baguio City took it over in 2005 and officially made it part of the Dominican Heritage Hill and Nature Park. But people still hear screaming. Some say the energy hasn't left because the history never really did. 9. The Sanzhi UFO Houses. In 1978, construction began on a strange new resort in New Taipei, rows of pod-shaped houses that looked more like props from a movie set than actual buildings. The project was meant to attract US military personnel stationed in the region, giving them a modern, out-of-the-way place to relax. But nobody ever checked in, and within 2 years, the site was abandoned. Several people tied to the site reportedly died under mysterious circumstances, including car crashes and other tragic ends, although the exact details remained fuzzy and rumors quickly followed. Some locals blamed it on bad luck after a dragon statue near the entrance was split during the early stages of development, something considered deeply disrespectful in Chinese tradition. Others claimed the land itself was haunted, possibly tied to the deaths of Dutch soldiers centuries earlier. No one ever moved in, and the whole thing was torn down sometime around 2008. 8. The Snowtown Bank. In 1999, police opened the vault of a long-abandoned bank in Snowtown, South Australia, and found 8 decomposing bodies sealed in plastic barrels inside. The victims had been murdered over the course of several years by a group of 4 men led by John Bunting. The majority of the killings took place in Adelaide, but the bodies were hidden in the bank vault to cover their tracks. In total, 11 people were murdered. The trial was massive, and the details were horrifying. Bunting received 11 life sentences, and his accomplices were also sent away for good. Today, the old red brick bank still sits empty on the main street. Its new owners sometimes open it to sell bric-a-brac to visitors, but it remains otherwise unused. 7. Camp Scott. If you're American, you might already know all about Camp Scott. For our foreign friends, this will probably sound like the plot of a Friday the 13th movie. In June 1977, on the first night of Girl Scout camp, 3 young girls were attacked in their tent. They were 8, 9, and 10 years old. By morning, their bodies were found on a trail near the showers. A few weeks earlier, a note had been found during staff training warning that 3 girls would be killed. It was brushed off as a prank. A local man, Gene Leroy Hart, was arrested but later acquitted. Decades later, DNA testing pointed back to him, but the evidence wasn't strong enough to close the case. The camp was shut down and never reopened. Most of the buildings are gone now, but pieces of it are still out there in the woods. 6. Devil's Island. I guess the name says it all, right? Devil's Island was once the most feared penal colony on the planet. Between 1852 and 1946, France shipped more than 80,000 prisoners here, and 1 in 3 didn't survive. Tropical disease was constant, floggings were routine, and prisoners were kept in tiny stone cells where they were chained and forbidden from speaking. Escape was practically impossible. The waters around the island were shark-infested, and the currents unforgiving. Most who tried didn't make it far. Public pressure eventually forced France to shut it down, and by 1950 the place was completely abandoned. What's left are vine-covered cells, rotting towers, and the rusted outline of a guillotine. 5. Willard Asylum. Tucked away in New York State, Willard Asylum opened in the 1860s with a goal that, for the time, sounded progressive. The idea was to give mentally ill people a place of refuge, not lock them in cells or poorhouses like society usually did back then. Dr. Sylvester D. Willard led the charge, and the asylum had a movie theater, a gym, even a bowling alley. Men and women were separated, of course, but the setup at least tried to seem humane. Still, the reality wasn't all comfort and care. Thousands of residents died there, and most were buried without names. Just numbers etched onto plain markers in the asylum's cemetery. Then came the real gut punch. When the hospital shut down in 1995, over 400 suitcases were discovered in the attic. They'd been left behind by patients who'd never made it out. Each one had been carried in by someone expecting treatment, filled with personal belongings, mementos, and none of them were ever reclaimed. 4. Los Feliz Murder Mansion. The well-known Spanish Revival mansion in Los Feliz sat untouched for over 50 years after a brutal murder. Dr. Harold Perelson murdered his wife on December 6, 1959, then attacked his teenage daughter. Afterward, he swallowed a lethal mix of acid and pills. The other children managed to escape. Soon after, a new couple bought the house, but for some reason never moved in. They used it for storage and left everything else exactly as it was. It was left complete with its 1950s furniture, old magazines, and even a Christmas tree with unopened presents beneath it. The place became a neighborhood legend. Thankfully, in 2020, the house was finally sold, and plans for its renovation were set in motion. 3. Châttice Castle. At one time, Châttice was home to Countess Elizabeth Bathory, the most prolific female serial killer in history. In the late 1500s, Bathory, or the Blood Countess, allegedly tortured and murdered hundreds of young women within her castle's walls. According to legend, she even bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Complaints by local nobles about missing girls finally prompted King Matthias II of Hungary to intervene, and in 1610, the Countess was arrested. Dozens of bodies and imprisoned girls were found. Bathory, being nobility, was never put on trial, but was bricked up in a castle tower and kept under house arrest until her death 4 years later. The castle's just a ruin today, open to tourists, but most don't stick around for too long. 2. The Cecil Hotel. If you have Netflix, you've definitely heard about the Cecil Hotel before. Over the decades, at least 16 unnatural deaths have happened here, including weird falls, murders, and some that still have no clear explanation. In 1962, a woman named Pauline Otten jumped from her 9th floor window and landed on a man walking below. Both died instantly. 2 years later, Pigeon Goldie Osgood, a retired telephone operator, was found murdered in a room. And serial killers stayed here too. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, lived on the 14th floor in 1985 while terrorizing the city. Another killer, Jack Unterweger, booked a room in 1991 and murdered 3 women nearby. Then came Elisa Lam in 2013. Her body was found in a rooftop water tank after guests reported foul-tasting water. The building was shut down in 2017 and later reopened in 2021 as low-income housing, but no renovation can erase what happened there. 1. Tuol Sleng. Tuol Sleng in Phnom Penh started out as a high school, but when the Khmer Rouge took over in 1975, it was turned into S21, a torture prison. At least 18,000 people were brought here over 4 years. Almost none of them made it out. Men, women, children, even babies were tortured here in ways that YouTube simply will not allow me to talk about. Some prisoners were also used in medical experiments and drained of their blood. Eventually, they would be transported to the killing fields and executed. Only 23 people are known to have survived. When Vietnamese forces finally reached the prison in 1979, they found the bodies of the last victims still on the metal beds. Today, Tuol Sleng is a museum. And that's it for me today. Some of those places are going to be bouncing around in my head for a while, not gonna lie. But before you head out though, quick trivia time. During Japan's occupation of Singapore in the 40s, what was the name of their military police force? Was it the A. Shinsengumi, B. Kempeitai, C. Toketai, or D. Kaigun Toketai? Drop your answers in the comments below. And after all that, let me just say our related video for today will be much more upbeat. It still involves houses, but it'll be mini ones.